Welcome to Taking Care of Business on Kern Radio Newstalk, 1180 for the best in Saturday Talk Radio with your host Clay Kerner, and I'm Marty Pay. Clay, really enjoyed our interview with State Senator Jean Fuller last week.
Jean's a fun lady.
Yeah, she really is, and they don't get much better than Jean. I wish we had more like her up in Sacramento.
And she's a California Republican, which is really unusual.
Yes, that's a dying breed.
Yes, it is.
I think there's more condors out there than there are California Republicans.
Could be.
Next week, we've got a very special guest, a name that's very familiar to those in California politics, Mark and Kathy Abernathy.
Yes, Mark and Kathy. They're really the influence of what's happening in the Republican Party in Southern California.
Yes, they are. We've had this running conversation about what direction the Republican Party is going to go and needs to go for the last couple of weeks, and we're going to continue that with Mark and Kathy. And in 3 weeks, we're going to have representatives from the Tea Party here in studio, and we're going to talk a little more about the party. In our fourth segment today, we're going to have our own City Councilwoman, Jackie Sullivan, talking about a special event.
Well, who's here today?
Today we have a very, very special guest by phone, and we're definitely going to talk about the direction of the Grand Ole Party with the author of a new book, American Individualism, How a New Generation of Conservatives Can Save the Republican Party. Welcome the great-granddaughter of President Herbert Hoover, Fox commentator, our guest, Margaret Hoover. Margaret, welcome to Taking Care of Business.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you, Marty and Clay, for having me.
Margaret, that was fun last night at the Reagan Museum. You gave a very, very good talk. It was a great event.
Thank you for coming. It was wonderful to be able. It's really an honor to be able to speak in such an incredible setting. And at the Reagan Library, no less, I draw a lot on Reagan themes throughout my book. And in terms of the direction conservatives should move forward, I think we have a lot to learn from Reagan. And so it was a wonderful place to be.
Well, since this is a Saturday show, Marty doesn't remember Wednesday was about 3 days ago.
Okay. So Thursday, or actually tonight, for those of you that realize this is a taped show, you're going to be at the Nixon Library.
I am. I'm going to be doing a slightly different show there. Last night was available to stream online, so I don't want to give the same performance, so I'm going to mix it up a little bit, and I look forward to being down in Yorba Linda, which I've also been to before. Both the Nixon Library and the Reagan Library are gems. You all are so lucky to have two presidential libraries within such a short circumference of land down here.
It's interesting, Margaret. I was stationed in El Toro years ago, but I have never been to the Nixon Library. So it's on my bucket list. But when I was stationed there, I used to see Nixon fly in on Air Force One and then take Marine One to San Clemente, because El Toro was where he used to come in those days. Now, I warned you yesterday a little bit about Clay. So, Clay, did you take your happy pill? I mean, we've got this nice lady on the phone.
You guys, come on! I take Bill O'Reilly every Thursday. I can take a little heat.
I can't take Bill O'Reilly.
See, Bill's too liberal for Clay.
No, he's a little too conservative.
Throw him at me. Let's go.
He's too conservative for Clay.
So I just want to start out with an interesting, something that I thought was interesting. You were talking a little bit about, and actually you mentioned in the book, because I got a chance to read a good part of it, about what it was like growing up as a president's great-granddaughter.
Well, the reality is, I think, most great-grandkids of presidents, it's not, even for me, it's, really the interesting stuff happens if you're first generation or second generation from the president. I didn't know Herbert Hoover. I was born 13 years after he passed away. So I'm the inheritor of many stories of his wit, his wisdom, his political philosophy, and my dad got the real good stuff, like getting taught by General MacArthur to play with his army soldiers and create a flank. Those sort of stories really stop about second generation, and so I am the inheritor of many of those. I mean, the one thing that's a little different being a Hoover is that he was the most vilified president of the 20th century. I mean, your relative gets hauled out every time there's a presidential election as the whipping boy for economic hard times. That's a little different. I don't think the great-grandkids of Truman deal with that as much as the great-grandkids of Hoover. I think even the Nixons don't get beat up in the, Richard Nixon doesn't get beat up in the press as regularly as Hoover, because there was this, this personalization of the economic narrative to Hoover's name, Hoovervilles, and Barack Obama is being called by right-wingers even now Barack Hoover Obama, and Mitt Romney is even, I grew up being used to Democrats vilifying Hoover, but not Republicans. And now that the narrative has shifted, even Republicans are beating up on Hoover, which is, I think, an enormous shame, not just because, Herbert Hoover was a man who, in his day, his contemporaries called him the great humanitarian. His biographers estimate that he saved up to 1 billion lives from starvation in the course of his lifetime by organizing famine relief efforts throughout Europe before, during, and after World War I and World War II. He was called the master of emergencies, partly for his work in humanitarian efforts, but also in the 1927 Mississippi River flood, which really catapulted him to the stage as the obvious Republican candidate for the presidency. This was the Katrina of his day, and he did massive organizational relief efforts there, using his position in the federal government, but also marshaling local and community resources, and then paying for it all in private funds. So he's a real icon and a sort of prophet of the conservative movement, and isn't getting a lot of credit from conservatives now for this. So I there's a little bit of I think a reevaluation that needs to happen with Herbert Hoover's legacy, and I'm committed to it. But I'm not alone. There are a lot of people who get the full 360 on Herbert Hoover and understand that he's been so marginalized and vilified historically that Americans aren't getting the full picture on him, and it's time for a reevaluation.
Yeah, I agree. I think he got a raw deal. We're having a conversation with author, Fox commentator, Margaret Hoover.
I want to know where Hoover came from, where Hoover was raised, where Hoover went to college, and what you're doing now. So,
me Hoover or Herbert Hoover?
You Hoover.
Oh, great, thanks. I'm used to talking about my great-grandfather.
I want to talk about you.
I was raised in Denver, Colorado. I'm from the West. I talk about conservative tribalism in my book because there's all these different kinds of conservatives. There's East Coast, country club Republicans and liberal, East Coast liberal conservatives. There's Goldwater conservatives. There's neoconservatives, paleo-conservatives, Southern conservatives. My dad toasted at my wedding that we're Western conservatives. I grew up in Colorado. Wasn't really interested, but always fascinated by Herbert Hoover and fascinated by our political system, but didn't have any internships in politics or work in politics or really have any desire to work in government. For most of my growing up, I studied languages. I was actually really inspired. Herbert Hoover spent the most of his first 40 years, and really after he turned 20, abroad. And I had a travel bug too. My mom was a flight attendant for United Airlines, and so I traveled a lot. I lived in Mexico. I lived in Bolivia. I studied Spanish language literature, and then I started studying Chinese, and so I lived in Beijing and studied Mandarin there for a semester. And after college, I got my first job in Taipei, Taiwan. Worked for a Taiwanese law firm in Taipei as a research assistant and a policy analyst for the senior partner of the law firm. And really just sort of was happy traveling with a backpack. And my first day when I got to Taiwan was 9/11.
Oh, my.
And I think that, all of us were just glued to our TVs during that time. And being, on the opposite side of the world, speaking a language and a culture that was so different at a time when Americans were experiencing, I think, the strongest outpouring of patriotism I've ever seen in my short life. I'm 33. Gave me the impulse to really want to be part of the functioning of our democracy. I'd always appreciated it from far, and so I worked my way back. I stayed in Taiwan for about a year and came back to the United States and found my way to Washington.
That's awesome. You've got quite a background for such a young girl.
Well, I do think it's important. Some people, it's very flattering. Some people say, we need a Hoover in politics. Are you going to run? And I say, God, no. Heavens, no. I think you need experience in life before you can offer your service to really lead people and be in public service. And, that's what I try to do by living and experiencing other cultures and languages abroad. And that's what I'm trying to do now. I think Herbert Hoover believed in public service, not politics. And, I think that I don't think you should be able to go into politics until you're 50. I think
there's some truth to that.
You have real experiences, earn a little nest egg, and then really have something to offer to public service.
You don't need a nest egg because when you go into politics, you come out extremely wealthy. But where'd you go to college?
I don't know know that that's always true. I think otherwise more people would flock to it.
Well, tell me who's come out.
I went to two. I started at a small liberal arts school in North Carolina called Davidson College. And then I transferred to another small liberal arts school, but in the Northeast, all women, very, very liberal, called Bryn Mawr.
You going to a liberal school?
Yeah, I did. I went.
Okay.
I was one of 5 Republicans at Bryn Mawr, and we formed a Young Republicans Club. There were 4 freshmen that came in when I was a senior, so 5 of us on campus total. It was, I've always been in the minority in my politics, but that was probably the apex.
Well, let's pick up there, and then when we come back, and I want to pick up and ask you the obvious question, which is what direction you think the Republican Party should go in. We'll be back in a minute on Taking Care of Business on Kern Radio Newstalk 1180.